Hello, and welcome back to the Ready for Merge show, hosted by yours truly, Christine D. Kim. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode. This is the second official biweekly brief for the Ready for Merge show. It is the third episode in the launch of this podcast. And I just want to start off the show by saying thank you so much to everyone who has been listening to the show so far, giving me feedback on its launch. I'm just really happy and pleased with the feedback that I've been getting on the show and how much you guys are vibing with the concept for the show and what I'm trying to do with the show. Um, I want to give a little bit of a shout out at the top of this episode about the music for this show. That for people that are joining in live, you're hearing the full track. That's like how I get into the groove of doing these biweekly briefs. And it's by a good friend of mine, a DJ in New York City, Kalios. I actually used to work with him at Galaxy. Yes, his job is working at Galaxy, but his passion is DJing. And he CJ, thank you so much. He was so gracious with allowing me to feature his music on these shows. I believe he's coming up with a new album soon, TM. So once that's out, I'm going to be sure to share it with you guys because if you like the music with the show and you're also vibing with it, that's good because I'll continue to feature it and tell you about perhaps any live shows that he does for anyone who's listening in the New York City area or wherever he's touring. Um, so yeah, you can find out more about Kalios in the show notes of all the episodes. I linked to his Spotify and the specific track that you hear at the top of these episodes, which of all the tracks, I was like, oh, I really want to use this one for the show for Ready for Merge. It's called Our Lives by Kalios. So shout out to Kalios. Um, okay, so we have a lot to discuss on this episode. I'm going to give you the updates on what is going on with Bitcoin and Ethereum protocol development. A lot has happened over the past 2 weeks since we last chatted. Quite a few developments in both the Bitcoin and the Ethereum ecosystems, especially as it relates to the protocol evolution of these technologies. So let's just get right into it. Let's start off with Bitcoin. There were two new PRs merged into the Bitcoin core code base. As a bit of a context for listeners that might not be super familiar with the Bitcoin development process, there is a main branch for Bitcoin Core software, which is the software that you use, that you download onto your computer in order to connect to the Bitcoin blockchain and validate all the transactions that are happening on the blockchain. And development is constantly happening on the main branch of the Bitcoin Core software. But every roughly 6 months, Bitcoin developers will bundle up all the latest changes that were made to and finalized into the main branch into an official release. So very recently, Bitcoin Core developers cut the V30 release, V30 major release for Bitcoin Core. And that is what some node operators are choosing to download and upgrade their Bitcoin nodes too. Now, Bitcoin Core developers are working on the V31 release, Bitcoin Core V31 software released. So in between the date in which the V30 final release went out and up until Bitcoin Core developers decide to do the V31 feature freeze, between that time window, all of the code changes that are merged into the main branch of Bitcoin Core, that is what's going to be included into the next upcoming major release. And two new PRs have been merged since we last spoke 2 weeks ago, which is pretty exciting, given that Bitcoin Core is such a valuable technology. Bitcoin as a protocol is just what everybody has been running. PR, the first, did I say that everybody's running? Well, a lot of people are running. Many people are running. Two new PRs that I want to talk about. These PRs, they're not as monumental or like they're not major changes to the Bitcoin code base. And to be frank, most of the PRs that emerged into Bitcoin Core, frankly, are not. But this show is about tracking all of the code changes, all of the code merges that are happening to both Bitcoin and Ethereum, big and small. So let's talk about what some of these code changes and recent merges have done. So PR 33157, this is a code change that is part of the cluster mempool, the work of the cluster mempool working group. And as a little bit of a side, again, just for more context for some of my listeners, which I know most of my listeners are probably Ethereum folk. But if you're not, welcome. As a side note, the working groups for Bitcoin are these groups of developers that are working towards a particular initiative or project as it relates to like maintaining or upgrading or adding a new feature to Bitcoin. And what's kind of interesting is on the Ethereum side, you have a lot of different client teams that come together and work collectively on like the Fusaka upgrade or a particular set of EIPs. Ethereum developers also have, or the Ethereum development community also has like breakout meetings to have dedicated development time and dedicated effort onto specific initiatives. So similarly, Bitcoin developers also have working groups. This is the terminology that they have, and these are these dedicated teams of people that are working towards a particular initiative together. What's interesting is that for Bitcoin development, a lot of these developers are just like individual contributors. Most of them are pseudonymous, and they don't particularly represent like companies or different clients. Frankly, the only client for Bitcoin that the vast majority of node operators run is just one client, Bitcoin Core. And there are several contributors to Bitcoin Core, individual contributors that are from a variety of different companies, some not even companies. They just simply get grants from whoever will give grants to Bitcoin Core type developers and work on it. So kind of the vibe for contribution and also the style of contribution is a bit different. And the way that Bitcoin developers really work and maintain the Bitcoin Core protocol is through the work of these working groups and also the contributions that individual contributors give to each of these groups. So this PR 33157 is a PR that has been in the works by the Cluster Mempool Working Group. And for years now, Cluster Mempool as a working group is working towards introducing better logic for processing and relaying unconfirmed transactions in the Bitcoin mempool. So instead of nodes treating and processing and validating transactions each individually, the work of the Cluster Mempool working group is so that nodes will be able to group together dependent transactions into clusters and then perform various operations on these clusters of transactions. So that block processing can be more efficient, so that when nodes are relaying transactions, they're relaying them in a more efficient manner. For example, if one transaction that is sent across like the Bitcoin P2P network, and the validity of that transaction actually depends on a different transaction, then you want your node to relay both of those together. And if one transaction fails and that causes a different transaction to fail, you want to be able to calculate the total fees for that block, and also calculate also the heaviness of that block, how many transactions are actually going to be included, with the information that certain transactions are dependent on one another. So this cluster mempool working group is trying to introduce that kind of logic and be able to make nodes a bit smarter about the way that they are relaying and processing these transactions, to be able to identify and more accurately be able to estimate the activity that's happening in a block by clustering dependent transactions together. So that's Cluster Mempool Working Group. They've been at it for a while, and this particular PR is just one piece of the larger puzzle. I noticed there's a little bit of a progress tracker for the entire cluster mempool initiative. Many of the boxes have been ticked. So a lot of progress has already been made on this initiative. And this PR, the latest one that's been finalized and merged into the Bitcoin core code base, really optimizes the transaction dependency data structure. So when Bitcoin nodes are keeping track of which transactions are dependent on the other, there's a data structure that they use, which is called the TX graph, the transaction graph. And I'm just going to quote directly from the PR for the PR through 3157, because I want to show that as much as people think protocol development, especially on the Bitcoin side too, is extremely technical, and it's like not something you're going to be able to understand as a first time, maybe interested party or newcomer. It's some of it is actually pretty pretty clear, even for a non-technical person like me. So I just want to highlight that. So let me do a direct quote from the PR itself. This is PR 33157. Direct quote. So the PR adds a bit of explainer on what the code changes do. It's on GitHub, and it reads, quote, "This PR." That's like in brackets. So this code change adds a few optimization to reduce transaction graphs memory usage and makes sure that the dynamic memory it uses doesn't linger after shrinking clusters. Finally, it exposes a function, get main memory usage function, to compute transaction graphs approximate memory usage. End quote. Okay. So yes, that might have sounded a bit technical, but when you read it and say it a couple times, you realize, okay, so this, in summary, this PR, really what it does is it reduces memory usage of the transaction graph, of that data structure for nodes, and it helps measure more accurately how much memory is being used by your nodes to compute this data structure, to compute the transaction graph that's keeping track of transaction dependencies. So okay, so that's the gist of the PR, and it's finalized and now added to the Bitcoin code base. So a bit of an exercise. Go out there and read some PRs. I think people would be surprised how much they really get out of and understand of what's going on, and what Bitcoin developers care about and are focused on. So that's in. The second PR that has been finalized and is now into the Bitcoin core code base is PR 29675. And this one is actually the final PR for the entire working group. This working group is called the MUSIG Multi-Signature 2, MUSIG 2 working group. And a little clapping, an emoji. Haha. Hooray! I think I'm going to do that every single time a working group completes its initiative and what everything that needs to get done. It's cool because I'm doing this on Riverside and it has all these cool like sound effects. But this is kind of a celebratory thing. Since I started tracking Bitcoin core development, there's only been 2 working groups that really completed everything that they needed to do. I think the other one was Orphan resolution working group that finished what they needed to do, and this is the final PR for multi-signature, for the second upgrade to multi-signatures, how multi-signatures happen on Bitcoin. So let's give a little bit of a rundown. Normally when there are multiple users or multiple individuals that control a Bitcoin address, and they all have to collectively sign off on on a transaction for that transaction to be made valid. The transaction on chain very transparently shows that there's multiple transactions that were needed to sign off on this transfer of Bitcoin, or whatever operation or action that's being taken with this account, or I should say address, because on Bitcoin they're all addresses. Accounts are used on Ethereum. Anyways, just like a slight little technical lingo thing. I don't think it matters that much for most listeners that are not super in the weeds of the technical lingo. But anyways, the addresses, the places where you own your Bitcoin and you sign off on transactions that are being sent from that address. And if it's controlled by multiple people, then you have multiple signatures, and that makes the transaction a bit heavier because it includes more data. It includes more data of various transactions or various signatures from these other parties, and it's quite clear to see, oh, this transaction is a multi-signature transaction. It's not like a normal user transaction where one person just had to sign off with their private key. Multi-signature 2, though, this little upgrade to the multi-signature scheme on Bitcoin, it is an upgrade to how this is done so that when people make multi-signature transactions, the individual private keys and signatures can be combined into one single signature. And so that not only makes the multi-signature transaction smaller, a bit less costly for the network to be propagated throughout the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network, it also adds a bit of privacy to make the Bitcoin transaction look identical to these normal one signature only transactions. So a bit of privacy gains and a bit more cost effectiveness for people that want to use multi-signature transactions on Bitcoin. And PR number 29675 was the final PR within this initiative. So hooray! It looks like the work for MUSIG 2 is done. So yeah, those are the two updates, the two code merges that happened to Bitcoin Core over the past 2 weeks. I know that they might not sound super exciting, especially when you consider some of like the headliner features that are coming out of Ethereum that make these wide, broad scoped changes to how networking as a whole is done on Ethereum, or these massive like scalability gains that will increase block size by like 33%, if not more, et cetera, et cetera. But although these PRs are smaller and they do take a lot longer for Bitcoin developers to really move through and work through, cluster mempool working group, when I was looking back on the GitHub history, this has been an effort since like 2023, and then for the multi-signature working group that I noticed on GitHub, the work goes as early back as early in 2024. The work can seem a lot slower, and these changes might seem very like minimal. So I think there's this like incorrect perception that nothing is happening on Bitcoin. Like I heard when I was starting to cover Bitcoin, a lot of people were like, "Is anything happening on Bitcoin? Really? Like, do you have anything really to even like cover with Bitcoin? There's really not much going on." But I actually think that's quite false. Like what I'm sharing right now, I've already been talking for maybe like 10, 15 minutes. It's a different kind of progress, though. I just think it's not that no progress is happening. It's that the progress is very different. Each of these little changes are changes that Bitcoin developers want to ensure can last in the Bitcoin code base for 10 plus years. The focus of Bitcoin Core developers are not about speed. Like progress is not measured by how many or how frequently they can change the Bitcoin code base. The focus is really about the resiliency of the code changes that they're making. And so the thought of, okay, if we change this like one part of the code base and make it that little bit more efficient or that little bit more private for our users, is it a change that's going to last and can be durable for the next decade? And so these code changes, there's a lot of work that goes into them, and they do reflect an evolving technology, a technology that is by no means perfect, but that developers are continuing to maintain and trying to improve little by little over time. And it's worth covering because Bitcoin itself is such a valuable open source protocol. On the flip side, on Ethereum, it's different. The culture is that progress is measured quite a bit by speed. How quickly can these code changes and ideas be shipped to Ethereum mainnet? Also, for Ethereum, there's a mindset that Ethereum should constantly be iterated and evolved. Most developers, when they're thinking about the code changes that they're making to the protocol, they really don't care if it's something that they're going to have to change in the next like 6 months or even like 4 months. Um, I think even recently I'm going to talk about this later in the show, but like with Fusaka, there are questions of like, is the pricing for this new opcode really correct? And Bitcoin and Ethereum developers on the call be like, even if it's not, let's just eyeball it and we can like update the price later and update the gas costs later. And not to say that that's a bad thing, but that it's different. It's a different mindset where Ethereum developers are very sure that iteration and speed is it is the most valuable way to upgrade this protocol. And for Bitcoin core developers, it's a very different mindset. So I just want to highlight that work and activity is happening on both protocols. They're just a different style of work and activity. A little bit the nature of these code changes are a bit different. So yeah, I'm slowly starting to become more familiar with the culture of Bitcoin development. So when two PRs emerged, no matter how small they are, I get excited because it's not every day, not every Bitcoin core developers meeting that you hear, oh, this working group is done. It's completed. Oh, like these PRs were finalized. That's a big milestone for Bitcoin core developers. So, yeah, a little bit different. But anyways, speaking of Ethereum updates, let's get into Ethereum updates on the second half of the show. I cannot believe the time. I really try and make these. I'm gonna. Okay, 11:26 already. On the Eastern Standard time zone. Ethereum updates. This is where the timestamp will go for Ethereum updates. Let's blaze through some of these updates. I have some important ones for Ethereum stakeholders to know, and not a ton of time. But that really is always the case with me, even people that know me from my prior podcasts. I do this to myself. I just ramble sometimes. Okay, let's talk about Ethereum. First update, the next major network-wide backwards incompatible upgrade, meaning all node operators on Ethereum, you gotta upgrade or you're gonna be on a different protocol, a completely different protocol that no one else is on. So Fusaka is the name of the next major network-wide upgrade. Developers are in the final rounds of testing, as I had mentioned on the prior biweekly brief. They had gone through the first of the 3 public testnets, testing out the Fusaka activation. It went smoothly on Haleshki, went smoothly on Sepolia. There was the testing of the blob parameter only hard forks, these automated hard forks that will happen after the main Fusaka upgrade activation. The first BPO went live midnight my time, Eastern time zone standard, my time, yesterday night, and looks to have gone well. I didn't see any major concerns on the Ethereum R&D Discord about it. So now developers are going to move on to the third and the final public testnet upgrade, October 28th, happening on the Hootie testnet. But by all indications, I just want to highlight and stress, it sounds as though Ethereum core developers are quite confident that Fusaka will be activated on Ethereum mainnet December 3rd. Now, of course, there might be some unexpected bug that happens on Hootie that changes up this timeline, but barring any of those unlikely events, it seems pretty certain that Ethereum developers will schedule Fusaka mainnet activation December 3rd. So node operators, Ethereum stakeholders, infrastructure providers, please get ready for the Fusaka upgrade, happening very surprisingly before the end of this year, which on the consensus layer side, it's the first time, I think, for Ethereum developers to ship 2 network-wide upgrades in 1 year. So surprising. I could say more about that, but in the essence of time, we have to move on. because I have three very important announcements actually on the Ethereum side. Um, don't know why I left this to the end of the show. First announcement: Haleshki, the Haleshki testnet is going to go down. Ethereum developers are not going to maintain it anymore. I believe infrastructure providers on Haleshki are already starting to migrate their software, wind down their machines. And obviously, if validators on Haleshki are being turned off, there is a very high chance that Haleshki testnet will fall into a state of non-finality, reduced security. So I just want to highlight to anyone who is listening, who has been testing software or infrastructure on Haleshki, the cutoff date for maintenance of that testnet is officially the end of this month, the end of October. However, I believe that I listened on the latest Ethereum developer call, the all-core developers call, and developers were saying that they've noticed some infrastructure providers are already starting to wind down their operations, wind down their validators on Haleshki. So that's the first announcement. Haleshki node operators, it will be no more soon. So please migrate to Sepolia or Hudi, and get ready for Fusaka. Second announcement: this is for smart contract developers, application developers on Ethereum. For Fusaka, there is an EIP, a code change in Fusaka, where developers are going to introduce a per transaction gas limit. 16 million gas will be the maximum gas that your transaction will be able to use up in a single block. No longer can you send transactions that have so much gas it fills the entire block. Not that this is a common thing. Really hilarious, but an Ethereum Foundation researcher, he's part of a particular team. I think it's protocol prototyping, but his name's Tony. And he did this analysis of like how many times has somebody tried to send just an extremely large transaction on Ethereum that fills the whole block. Turns out very rare, extremely rare. Now, no one really does this. However, there are smart contract developers that may be used to or rely on batching transactions together, batching various operations on chain together, and collectively, the gas of that transaction or that batch transaction may exceed the new limit. If that's the case, please be aware and update your operations so that doesn't happen, because if you exceed the new transaction gas limit after the Fusaka upgrade goes live, your transaction is going to be invalid. As a little bit of context for why developers are doing this, there's a couple of reasons. The first is that in the Glamsterdam upgrade, which is the next upgrade after Fusaka, that developers are already planning, really quite well along in terms of development, let me say. We're not going to have time to get into the DevNet updates for Glamsterdam on this episode. No way. But anyways, there's a code change on Glamsterdam called the block level access lists, and it basically is going to allow nodes to be able to execute certain transactions in parallel within a block to make block processing a lot more efficient on Ethereum. Hopefully we'll get some real good actual numbers on exactly how much more efficient as the weeks go on, because I would like to know, as probably you would too, listeners. So yes, developers are preparing for that code change. And if you introduce a per transaction gas cap, a per transaction limit to these transactions, then estimating and predicting kind of the structure of a block, the transactions that will be included in a block becomes more efficient. It just becomes easier. It becomes easier for the protocol to reason about it, because now there is no realm and possibility where this one block could have just one transaction or none. Now it's like every single transaction will have a particular cap, and so at maximum, the block, depending on the block gas limit, will have a maximum of X amount of transactions in that block. And so predicting, it makes block makeup contents, gas contents, more predictable. So yes, that is the primary motivation for that EIP. I'm sure there are other kind of nice things related to that EIP around denial of service attacks. And actually, just in terms of making Ethereum transactions a bit more proportional to how much, um, well, part of the rationale for that EIP actually made me think a little bit of certain changes that are going into the Great Consensus cleanup on the Bitcoin side. This is another different working group or proposed software proposal that's pretty far along in the Bitcoin development side. And within the Great Consensus cleanup, there's actually these like code changes that are designed to also make transaction, like the contents of a transaction and how much resource it's using up on the network, more proportional to the amount of data that it carries. Anyways, this is so much of a tangent, but it made me think a little bit of how similar some of the motivations for these code changes are between Bitcoin and Ethereum. Anyways, if you want to know more about the Great Consensus Cleanup, it is quite interesting. I do give a full rundown of what the Great Consensus Cleanup is in my latest Bitcoin newsletter, BTC Before Light, which is actually why it's top of mind, because that newsletter went out this morning. But anyways, I digress. Let's move on to the third announcement. So Polsky node operators, smart contract developers, and application developers on Ethereum for the transaction gas limit. The third and the final announcement that I have for on the Ethereum protocol side is for layer 2 node operators. L2s. Hello. Cell proofs. I'm sure many of you have already been thinking about this as developers were discussing that on the Sepolia testnet upgrade, when Fusaka went live, surprise, so many, not so many, but apparently quite a few L2s noticed that their rollups stopped working. The blob transactions didn't work anymore. So the Ethereum Foundation has created a blog post to explain what is going on and how layer 2 node operators should prepare for Fusaka. And I'm going to tell you about it right now, in case you did not get the memo. Fusaka activates PeerDAS, this code change that will allow data availability sampling of blob transactions. Right now, every single node needs to download the full contents of a blob, these batch transactions from the L2 that have been committed down to Ethereum for some data availability. Basically, you can think about Ethereum like a bulletin board. You posted all the transactions that have been processed on your L2 onto Ethereum, and many people can go to Ethereum, this decentralized protocol where anyone can see what transactions are being processed and take a look at the data. And those batch transactions, those blob transactions, right now, all the nodes need to download it in full and process that in a block in full. However, post PeerDAS, one of the improvements is that nodes will be able to sample the data within these blobs, and by multiple samples through this mathematic kind of probability scheme, nodes will be able to be assured, and the protocol will be able to verify that the full contents of the blob have been posted to Ethereum for data availability for users to be able to for the decentralized, anyone who's part of the decentralized network that is Ethereum, to be able to evaluate the blob contents as need be. Like, for example, if there's any kind of I don't know, like malicious or like transaction that was not valid but was processed on the L2, kind of as a what am I saying? Well, I'm trying to explain kind of fraud proofs here, but I'll come back to this at another time on another episode. But the point is that there's data that L2s want to commit down to Ethereum, so that there's greater availability of that data for people to verify and for people to fact check. There we go. That's better. Anyways, so blob proofs. That right now, all the blob transactions need to be fully downloaded, and the proofs for these transactions happen for the entire blob. At any time there's a blob transaction that's submitted, there is an associated proof that is associated with the entire blob contents. Cell proofs, on the other hand, are a new type of proof for blob transactions that instead of verifying or validating the full blob, it only validates parts of the data in that blob. And that's exactly what you want for peer DAS, peer data availability sampling, to be able to sample different components of the blob and create proofs of them. But that requires a bit of a transition. No longer are blob proofs being generated with the blob transactions, but now cell proofs. And so that is a new type of proof generation that, according to the design of PeerDAS, is something that should be done by the L2s themselves, the submitter of the blob transaction. However, there are some workarounds that L2s can take advantage of if they, for some reason, just like cannot or don't want to do the proof conversion from blob proofs to cell proofs. There is an RPC on the RPC layer using for Geth nodes. For any RPC providers that are going to be operating Geth, there is on the RPC layer a way for the conversion from blob proofs to cell proofs to happen, to be computed on the node side, on the Geth node. However, that's not all clients. Not all clients are going to be able to support that kind of conversion. I believe that it's only Geth. There were talks that Nethermind also might be able to make this as a default feature, but it's not something that all L2s can bake on for all the clients. So it's important that L2s double check, and ideally that L2s also just simply move forward with support for converting blob proofs to cell proofs. And it's probably a good thing too, because I believe for the Geth team, they're going to eventually deprecate support for RPC conversion of these proofs. Quick other thing that's noted also in the EF blog post about how Fusaka is going to impact L2s. At the time of the fork, when Fusaka happened, some of the clients are going to be dropping transactions, blob transactions that generate these old format of the proofs, blob proofs. But other clients intend to do a conversion of transactions, of blob transactions that have the blob proofs and convert them into self proofs. However, again, this is a little bit of a deviance in behavior. So it's important that L2s check whether your blob transactions have been successfully included into an Ethereum block or whether they were dropped. And if they were dropped, you need to resend that block transaction. So some important notes to get prepared for. Remember, as the date for Fusaka mainnet activation draws nearer, I'm going to link into the show notes the official Ethereum Foundation blog post announcements regarding how Fusaka is going to impact L2s and then the transaction gas limit. I don't know if there's actually an announcement out for Haleshki yet, but they did announce it in a different blog post earlier on in September that I'll link to if there's no updated one. So check out the show notes of today's episode if you want more information. That really is it for the Ethereum updates. I know some people were like, oh, I thought you were going to talk about like the Dankrad stuff and the Peter and the blah, blah, blah stuff. No, I already said exactly what I wanted to say about those issues. I said what I said. If you want to find those, you'll find them on my newsletter. You'll find them on my X. Really, this time that I have allotted for this episode there was just so many protocol updates and highlights that I needed to share that no, we're not gonna get into that in this episode. 4 things on the back end. Thank you so much for listening, you guys, to this entire episode. Thank you for joining me. 4 things on the back end. Number 1, if you liked this episode, please be sure to give it a like or comment, interact. Number 2, if you haven't already, please subscribe so you get notified of the next episodes. And I am very excited to say that the next episode is going to be the official release of my Meet the Devs interview with Geth developer Marius van der Wijden. I feel as though, yes, Peter was a very prominent, he was the Geth team lead for a very, very long time, and he's shared some pretty intense views around the Ethereum Foundation, I think it's important to share another view from another Geth developer that has also been around for quite some time, Marius, and his contribution and his views on what is going on with Ethereum protocol development, what is going on with the future of Ethereum and future Ethereum development. A lot of really great insights in that episode. So I want to share that with you guys and just open this up as a resource more broadly to give you another perspective on Ethereum protocol development from another Geth team member. So that's coming out next week. Stay tuned. And then I'll be back the following week again for another bi-weekly brief. Third thing, if you like the episode, please be sure to share it. Is this the fourth thing? Comment, like, subscribe. Next thing was meet the devs. Okay, fourth thing, the final thing. Yay, final thing. Please share the episode if you thought it was useful. If you think someone else is going to be interested in getting these updates, or there's a particular update in this episode that you want to share, feel free to share it with your colleagues and friends. This was the live episode, but I'm going to edit it and release it out on all the podcast channels. Literally every podcast channel you can think of, this show will probably be uploaded there. So feel free to share it around. With that, you are now officially caught up on what's ready for merge in the Bitcoin and Ethereum code bases. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you all again another time.